Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to The Cause of Freedom, a conversation with President Jonathan Holloway on the history of African Americans. I hope that you are all safe and well from wherever you're joining us this afternoon. And I thank you so much for being here for what promises to be a very meaningful conversation. I am our moderator this afternoon, and I am Michelle Stevens. So I'll tell you a little bit about me. I'm a professor of English and Latino and Caribbean Studies at the School of Arts and Sciences at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. My scholarship focuses on Caribbean, African American, and American literature, culture, and history. I also have the pleasure of being the very recently appointed founding executive director of the Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice at Rutgers. This is an institute funded in 2020 by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation with a $15 million grant for 5 years. I'd like to say here, this is an award I would never have had the courage to apply for on my own, and I want to thank President Holloway publicly for his encouragement, which motivated me to submit our proposal for the Institute on the university's behalf. Please do look up our recent stories in Rutgers Today, describing the Institute's starting principles and vision as reflected by our leadership team, who are myself, historian Erica Dunbar from New Brunswick, legal scholar Elise Boddy from Newark, and poets Pat Rosal and Greg Pardlow from Camden. You can also find out more about us at Global Racial Justice at rutgers.edu. It is my honor and pleasure this afternoon to moderate our discussion with President Holloway about his research on the history of African Americans and what it means to be an American, a citizen, and a human being. This event is being held in conjunction with Black History Month and the publication of President Holloway's new book, The Cause of Freedom, A Concise History of African Americans. I have a copy right here. First and foremost, I would like to thank the Rutgers African American Alumni Alliance Incorporated and the Rutgers University Alumni Association for co-sponsoring this event. The Rutgers African American Alumni Alliance Incorporated, or RAAA Incorporated, works to establish a medium for supporting, advancing, and strengthening the intellectual, cultural, social, and academic concerns of alumni, students, faculty, and staff of African descent and the community at large. The Rutgers University Alumni Association, or RUAA, helps Rutgers alumni stay connected to the university and to other alumni through innovative programs, services, and volunteer opportunities. RUAA's mission is to strengthen Rutgers, build community, and foster Scarlet Pride through the meaningful engagement of all current and future alumni. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest of honor, President Jonathan Scott Holloway, who began his official tenure as the 21st president of Rutgers on July 1st, 2020. Now, President Holloway is no stranger to academic leadership, arriving at Rutgers after holding a number of high-level positions at prominent American universities. In 2014, he was named Dean of Yale College, having taught at Yale since 1999 as Edmund S. Morgan Professor of American Studies, History, and American Studies. In 2017, he became provost of Northwestern University and led in that capacity until joining our community. At Rutgers, he serves not only as president of the university, but also as a university professor and a distinguished professor. In that capacity, as a writer and scholar, President Holloway specializes in post-emancipation U.S. history with a focus on social and intellectual history. He's written works on such Black intellectuals as Abram Harris Jr., E. Franklin Frazier, and Ralph Bunche. And he's thought a lot about the unique features of Black intellectual leadership, especially in the careers of such figures as Ralph J. Bunche, who was the first African-American to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1950, and W.E.B. Du Bois, the first African-American to earn a doctorate at Harvard and author of, among many other works, The Souls of Black Folk. Jonathan Holloway's most recent book, The Cause of Freedom, offers him an opportunity to reflect on and explore further many of the historical currents he's focused on throughout his academic career. In celebration of Black History Month, we thought it would be especially illuminating to join him in a conversation that can bring some of these topics concerning Blackness, history, freedom, and Americanness to the forefront of the conversations going on in our Rutgers community. encouraging everyone here not just to appreciate their importance during this 1 month out of the year, but to understand in greater depth how the history of African Americans speak to issues central to how we live and understand our humanity on a daily and long-term basis. President Holloway will speak to us for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then I'll engage him in conversation based on some of your questions you've already sent in. Thank you all, and some of my own. With that, let me give a warm welcome to Rutgers President Jonathan Holloway.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I'm sorry you were burdened with that lengthy introduction, but I do appreciate it. Thank everyone for coming here today. It's really exciting for me to be part of this conversation, and it's not because of my book. I mean, sure, I'm very proud of it, and that's what we'll spend our time focusing on, but I'm really excited that you took time out of your day to spend time in the Rutgers community, to come back home, as it were. I mean, I am new to Rutgers. I'm 7.5 months in, but when I was considering whether to apply for the job or not, I was drawn to the fact that I saw in Rutgers a place that had a great track record when it came to being committed to having a diverse community, that had a collection of scholars, of vibrant scholars across all of our campuses who are committed to doing this kind of work. And I saw a student body that was very exciting to me to think about trying to help lead and trying to help be someone who could help transition them from a particular set of life circumstances in high school to doing something on the other side of a college experience or a grad or professional experience. So I'm just thrilled that I have the opportunity to be a leader in this community and to join you in the great work of what makes Rutgers so special. Now, this is a tricky moment, and before we get to the book, I do want to offer sort of a public service announcement, recognizing how hard this moment is for everybody. The virus, while dropping quickly in terms of positive rates and death, which is great, is still at higher numbers than it was last summer. We have a lot of work to do to get past where we are in terms of navigating this virus. We'll get there. It's just going to take time. We've seen recent disturbing events, and some including deadly violence against the core of our democratic institutions, against other citizens and civilians. I've never seen anything like it in my lifetime. And we have work to do there as far as trying to restore a sense of common good and commonality. And in my opinion, and we'll get into this in the conversation, we have work to do to understand that our commonality is not just about one individual's group's set of experiences, but really about the breadth of possibilities that are represented in this country's history, a history that we too often don't pay honest attention to in terms of its breadth, in terms of its vibrancy. And I think the more that we understand the great power in this country comes from its diversity, the better off we'll be, and the more honest speakers will be about our own past. So we have work to do there. We have work to do in just navigating a global moment of racial and cultural reckoning, and that's been exacerbated by this virus. It's hard. I want to name it as such. And if you're feeling overwhelmed by this moment, you are not alone in this. But there are ways in which you can make a personal impact. You can make personal impacts by being committed to getting the vaccine when you're able to get that vaccine. I know that's a particularly complicated space in many African American communities because of long histories of distrust between institutions and histories, really horrible histories about medical procedures and such. We're in a different moment. So I've joined with other New Jersey African American college presidents, university presidents, to really encourage people to get that vaccine. It's for everybody's good. And as someone who has suffered from COVID, I was sick in January, thankfully with a mild case. The fact that I had a mild case and knowing what it felt like to go through that makes me that much more committed to making sure we do our part in getting that vaccination to make sure we can all recover, get back on our feet. While we're doing that, I think there's an opportunity to help others get back on their feet as well through offering resources. If you are fortunate enough to come from a place of resources that allow you that roof over your head, the clothes on your back, and food that you're not wondering where the next meal is coming from, remember that there are plenty of people in the Rutgers community who don't have that same set of benefits. And one of the things that I did right when I started as president is to pay attention to our Scarlet Promise Grant program, which is dedicated to helping our students from the most fragile socioeconomic backgrounds to make sure they can remain as Rutgers students and get on that rocket ship that our Rutgers education provides, and have really dedicated a lot of my own personal resources and university resources to try to expand that program. And this is one way that I know that all of you, any of you, can make a difference. And many of you have already given to the Scarlet Promise Grant Initiative, and I thank you for that. It is really about investing in this moment to help get past it, but investing in the next generation of our society's leaders. So thank you for those who have given, and thank you for those who will consider giving. Anyway, on to the topic at hand today. I'll take a handful of minutes, Michelle, to explain how I came to this project in the first place, and then we'll open it up to questions and to a conversation, which I'm really looking forward to. So the title of the book, The Cause of Freedom: A Concise History of African Americans. When I was approached to consider writing this book, goodness, I think maybe, let's say 5 years ago, I can't remember when I was approached off the top of my head. I thought a history of African Americans. Now I specialize in post-emancipation African American history. So I thought, well, gosh, I'm Dean of Yale College. I've got a lot of things on my plate. I don't know if I'll have time to write a book. But the editor said, we want a really short book. I'm like, okay, a short book on post-emancipation history. And she said, no, a short book on all of African American history. Now, she had made clear this is a project that through Oxford where they didn't want the book to be more than 150 pages manuscript, which is double-spaced, 12-point font, 1-inch margins. And I looked at her like she was kidding me. It is impossible, I said, to write an over 400-year-long history in 150 pages. And she flattered me saying, I'm sure that you can find a way to do it, Jonathan. And we went back and forth for the better part of a year before I finally thought, okay, I think there's a way forward. And then clearly I accepted the invitation, and here we are. The way forward for me, just to get a bit behind the scenes, is I've been giving lectures on post-emancipation African America for over 15 years. And so I was able to, in my mind, have half the book written in rough draft, that part that was post-emancipation. And so that's why I ended up saying yes, because then I could write the pre-emancipation parts. What I hadn't processed is that I had 26 lectures, was my post-emancipation course. Each chapter was less than the length of one of my lectures when it's written out. So I had 26 chapters to squeeze into 3. So right away, I had a big problem that I had to navigate. And then, even though I know in broad strokes pre-emancipation history, I'm not a specialist in it. So I figured I needed to learn a whole bunch of stuff. So this was my project for about a good 2 years, trying to figure out how to write the book. And then for historians who like to include everything, I had this emancipating moment. I realized this is not about including everything. It's about figuring out what things I don't have to write about and still tell a story. And then the thing that allowed me to tell the story is recognizing I couldn't write everything. It's like, well, what are guiding questions that can help open up further conversations, that can invite readers to understand the nuance of the African American past, the American past, so that they can then be inspired to go off and keep searching and look for things that are of interest to them. And for me, when I thought about the pre and post-emancipation experience, I came down to a series of questions. And they are, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be an American? What does it mean to be a citizen? And what does it mean to be civilized? And these more or less aligned with key historical moments in the Black past. And I thought, okay, if I structure the book around these questions, then we're onto something. Then we can start discussing how work had to be done, for example, to create a racialized system of slavery. And there had to be some rationalization behind it. And that rationalization revolved around the fact that colonists began to think of Africans as something less human than the white indentured servants they labored next to in, say, colonial Virginia. And we have a whole literature that explains this evolutionary process. They can start thinking about African laborers as people who didn't have it in them to be fully civilized. And that made it easier to rationalize the way towards forced labor, and also a labor that would be inherited, or a condition of servitude that would be inherited through mothers' births. So if you take certain kinds of questions and really push on them, it starts to open up the doors to think about really important notions of US history. And Michelle, get ready to open up questions. I'm going to start, or open up our conversation. I want to land on this last little bit. So in the invitation to ask larger questions of American history, I turn to, I mean, we can look at current events, frankly. I recently published a piece in the New York Times, an op-ed a week ago, in fact, that linked events from January 6th, the insurrection at the Capitol, linked the White House Commission, 1776 Commission, that was very unhappy with the New York Times 1619 Project, saying this was a too negative assessment of the American past. I linked these events to a failure to understand Black history. That if you understand these core questions in the past, the ones that I've used to access the African American past, you can recognize that a refusal to be, to admit to asking these questions, to say, doubting African American humanity, declining Blacks' claims on being Americans or being citizens, believing that Blacks aren't fully civilized. If you understand that people have answered those questions in those ways, then you start to see so many of how so many of the challenges of the Black experience were birthed. They were birthed by people saying, no, you're not human. No, you can't be American. No, you can't be a citizen. And no, we don't think you're civilized. And if you have that kind of attitude, you start to get to a point where the Proud Boys and other white supremacist groups that were the insurrectionists at the Capitol were trying to defend a set of ideals in this country that are really in great violence to the history of the actual history of this country. That they're trying to preserve something only for themselves and only on a very small set of terms. And those were terms that denied people access to being Americans. And it's not just African Americans here. I'm talking about immigrants from so many different parts of the world. I'm talking about women in so many moments in our history. I'm talking about poor people overwhelmingly. Talking about people who have been written out of history because these questions have been answered in very limited and very painful ways. So this book, while a short history of the African American experience, is asking questions that can be applied to so many other aspects of the American experience. And the answers are hard, but that's okay. I think one of the great things about being at a university is that we are unafraid to do hard things, at least we better be. And we need to be confident that in asking hard questions, we will get better answers and make for a better society. Anyway, that's a bit of how I came to the project, what I wanted to, how I learned to write the project, and what I've taken away from the project. And Michelle, I'm happy to have you
I will jump right
address
in.
all these kinds of issues.
Yes, you have given us a lot already to start with. So I wanted to pick right up on, you made different moments in your opening remarks, Jonathan. You talked about history, which I thought of kind of as capital H, and then you referenced histories. And so I wanted to begin right in the present. After the events of January 6th, I was really struck by a kind of debate that I was seeing unfolding in popular media. You had some people, when they were discussing the insurrection at the Capitol, talking about the way in which it did or did not fit into a certain historical narrative about American politics and American society. There was this debate whether the lens we should be using when turbulent political things happen is one of, we're not living up to our ideals as Americans, or whether it's not really a single set of ideals that shape America, but rather that history shows many different paths for thinking about what America is and what America can be. And that maybe it's in precisely these moments of political unrest that we start to see that. So I wanted to ask you if you could speak a little bit about where you might enter into this debate based on the insights that you've gained from writing this work and from your scholarship. Like, does American history reflect one set of ideals, or does it reflect different paths?
Yeah. Well, I think these, I mean, you laid out a lot of this stuff very well. These things are in tension, I guess is the best, the shortest answer. Let me tease that out. Mm-hmm. There is no doubt that the founding doctrines of this country are astonishments. And I really mean that quite seriously. They are astonishing for the way they broke with what had been established practice in so many parts of the world, in world history, about how you organize a society. But they're also deeply flawed because they preserved forced labor. I mean, they had built in a sort of logic based on political compromise, sure, but based on philosophy and ideology also, that really was about the creation of second-class status for people. Whether they could even become second-class citizens is a different issue, but second-class status. So there is a tension throughout our country's history, starting at the very beginning, between its ideals in concept and its ideals as, okay, once you get down to the brass tacks, what does it really mean that you only count as 3/5 of a person and things like that. So when I think of like January 6th, I mean, I've named it, you've named it. It felt to me, as taking off my historian's hat, as a citizen, like, my God, truly, without hyperbole, democracy is at stake in this moment. And I was very nervous. I mean, governance is at stake. Peaceful transfer of power, which is a radical idea in the world history, excuse me, but that we have done without interruption for so long, was now in play. So part of me is saying, I've never seen anything like this. But then I put my historian's hat on, like, now, but wait a second. This is a radical manifestation of a long conversation in US history that one can trace back to the flawed aspects of our founding documents and our founding fathers. Now, historians are always trying to be careful about being too arrogant when we look backwards, that those of us in 2021 would never stand for X, Y, or Z. Well, that's kind of hard to say because we weren't there in 1975, 1875, 1820, 1782. I mean, we weren't there. And it's really, we have to recognize that sensibilities, worldviews, demography, all these things were different. So we have to be mindful. So I think the thing that that overwhelmingly I come back to is that we are in a remarkable moment. I absolutely think that. I think we are in a moment that's been hypercharged by deep partisanship that took on a special fervor the last 4 years, but has been building for a while now. This is not just about the last 4 years. but that the country has within it the potential for its own perfection. Because I choose to be optimistic. That perfection is going to be hard to achieve. One aspect of it is that we take an expansive notion of our own history, that we start to write people into history. And will it make it harder? Yeah, it will make it harder. Will it all be rosy? No, it won't. But the fact is, this country has survived for all this time. It is remarkable that it has survived. That's a good story to tell.
Well, I found, one of the things that I thought was helpful, even you do it in your introduction, you did it here in your opening remarks, is by framing those 4 original questions around Americanness, humanity, citizenship, civilization. You've already pulled us to think about what are the kind of deeper stakes and the broader stakes of African-American history. So I kind of wanted us all to hold that in mind. And I have a second question of my own I'm going to ask, and then I'm going to shift a little bit to some of the questions that I know have come from our audience. And so mine has to do more with the writing process. So I know that as a writer, there are certain decisions that we make in almost every moment about both what to write and what not to write about. You mentioned that a little bit in your opening. So I really thought about that when I was looking at your subtitle, this idea of a concise history of African Americans. You talked a little bit about that too. Maybe you could expand a little bit on just what are one or two of the most important decisions or choices that you felt you made in regard to being precise or concise while writing this book?
Yeah, I mean, you've hit upon all these things. I know as an author, you understand the process as well. But one thing I want to emphasize for those who aren't authors, every sentence is a choice. Like everything you say, you're not saying something else. And that makes the writing process, it's a process. It is difficult. The simpler it looks, I often think, is the harder it's been to get to that, to get to that place, because you've cut out so many things that you think are valuable. So that's part of it. And I know you've had this experience where there are some stories that I love telling. I love telling that were in an earlier draft, the version I submitted to the press, and the editor, and I thought I came in exactly on the right word count. The editor said, you have to cut 8,000 more words. 8,000? So with tears in my eyes, I cut truly some of my very favorite stories that I thought did all this heavy lifting. And when I cut them and looked back at it, I'm like, I hated to say it, but it flowed better. It had a lighter touch to it. And so these choices are hard, but they're choices we have to make. From a conceptual standpoint, knowing that I had really, it felt like impossible decisions to make about what not to write. Think about this. Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, extremely important individuals when it comes to the African-American experience. Very complicated individuals, but no one can say they are anything but critically important. Okay, I think, I've never tallied it up, but I think combined, these two people, Lincoln has had more books written about him than any other individual except for Jesus. That is a literal fact. So the most written about person that we know about in history got 3/4 of a page, I think. Jefferson got a half a page, I think. And for me, that's just a hard thing to wrap my head around. How can you do that? I'm like, well, the fact is there are millions and millions of people we have never heard from. And I can't include all of them, but I can include people who represented them. So I made a very conscious decision, and it's not something the casual reader will pick up. But if you look at the balance of who is being quoted, like whose voices are we hearing in this history, this short history? If you take out Lincoln and Jefferson, it's impossible to eliminate them entirely, but if you take them out, I'm not sure that there are many other white voices quoted in the text. Like I quoted Black voices. It was important for me that if I'm telling on a very abbreviated version of African-American history, I want Black speakers to be heard. Because, my point is that so many times they have not been heard, or they've been added in as the postscript to a larger story. Or, if their name isn't Martin Luther King Jr. or Frederick Douglass, or maybe now Rosa Parks, they aren't going to be included in the history.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wanted to make sure there are more people at the table. That might make people go to Wikipedia or Google or perhaps more scholarly places to find out who these individuals are. That'd be great. But if nothing else, I've introduced people back into the conversation. In fact, the title of the book is taken from someone that people who study African-American past know quite well as a very powerful individual, Anna Julia Cooper, but who by and large is not well known, to put it mildly, in the larger discourse of American history.
Mm-hmm.
And she is the lead quote in the book, and the cause of freedom is an excerpt from a line in her signature text. So it really was about making sure other voices were being heard in this really, I think, fascinating conversation.
Mm-hmm. Well, actually, that's a great segue then for me to try to bring a few other voices in to join us. I'm sorry we can't do it with your actual voices, but I'm going to try and speak on the behalf of some of our audience members by turning to some of their questions, kind of fall into a few different categories. Some are about the book, but Jonathan, if it's okay, I'm going to also ask a few about kind of social issues more broadly and what's happening and how they relate to what's happening at Rutgers more specifically. And everyone out there, please, my sincere apologies in advance. If my phonetic pronunciations of your names are completely off the mark, forgive me. And you can correct me in person or in Zoom person at another point. So this first question actually comes from Mal Davis, who is a 2007 graduate from Mason Gross School of the Arts. And Mal asks if the climate created by the social injustices of 2020 influenced the cause of freedom, since those were happening as you were finishing up the work.
Right, that's a good question. And no and yes. Yes and no. I'm trying to think, there's an order that probably makes the most sense. Well, I'll say yes and no. Yes, in terms of the production of the book itself. So this book, book writing takes a long time. And then book production takes the literal making of the book takes a long time. And this is with an academic press, Oxford University Press. So academic presses move more slowly than for-profit presses. That's just the industry. When I submitted the book in October of 2019, which means it goes into a process of final vetting and things and that's when I was told I had to cut 8,000 words. So I wasn't quite done yet. But in that process, the editors, and as we headed into the spring of 2020, the editors made a decision to fast track the book. So, a book just doesn't appear in a month's time unless it's a self-published book, let's say, this is not that case. So my book was slated to come out in October of 2021 or thereabouts. And they made the decision in light of the events of 2020 to fast track it and get it out now. So that meant they took a book out of their queue and swapped places, for which I personally am grateful. But I apologize to whoever's book I pushed back, but that's the factor. So 2020 really did accelerate the release of the book, because they knew that this was, for tragic reasons, a book whose story needed to be told as soon as possible. Now, when it comes to the events of 2020, how did they affect me in the writing of the book? That's where the answer becomes a really painful one. And the answer is no, it didn't affect my writing. In the final stages with copy edits, this is the author's last chance to do anything in the book. And as Michelle will attest, they get very, if you change a sentence, it can't add another line to the page. That's literally the detail they get into because of the way things are blocked. But the copy editor said, there is space for you to offer a few paragraphs about George Floyd. Can you do it here? And I really wrestled over it because there was room to add 2 or 3 paragraphs. But again, how do I tell that story in 2 or 3 paragraphs? And in the end, and then reasons I didn't do it, I'm like, well, whose story do I tell? Ahmaud Arbery's? Breonna Taylor's,
Mhm.
George Floyd's. And the
Mhm.
thing is, I knew that, and I hate to say it, but this is being the absolute truth. I knew there would be more events. There would be more moments like George Floyd after I wrote that paragraph, those 2 paragraphs. This is the history of this country. This is not to take anything away from the tragedies that we saw in 2020, not at all. But they weren't new. They were captured in new ways. They were felt in new ways. They resonated in new ways. That's important. And I suppose I could have said something about that, but the book ends talking about Black Lives Matter and how it had changed the tenor of conversation. So I think that element of change was already there. But the fact is, it didn't include that part because it is part of a much longer narrative. And there would be so many names that I'd have to include to do it justice.
Yeah. So I'm curious, both for myself and because I know a number specifically of the alums of African American descent in the audience are interested in this too. If you could talk a little bit about Africana Studies and African American Studies as a field. So just to kind of give some context, we have a lot of scholarly talent and depth in this broader area of global Black studies, Africana Studies, African American Studies across the New Brunswick, Newark, and Camden campuses. And it seems to me that so much of the depth of your knowledge is steeped in you yourself being an African Americanist. So could you say a little bit about the field, how you see the culture, history, and politics of the African diaspora enriching the university community? Do they intersect with the narrative that you created in the Cause of Freedom? Just kind of link the two.
Yeah, thank you. It's a big question, of course, but it's an important one. When I think about, as I've already said, African American history and American history are inextricably, they are woven together. They are of the same thing. When we think of the history of the creation of what I'll simply call variously titled Black Studies programs, this is their first name was Black Studies in the 1960s, growing out of campus protest around the country. These students were saying, but where's our experience? I mean, this is where's our experience in the curriculum, in the pedagogy, and universities hadn't been inclusive in that way. They just weren't, whether it was intentional or unintentional. It's probably both, basically. They hadn't been inclusive in thinking about larger questions, larger experiences, et cetera. And so you have these programs and departments being born in different ways. And Rutgers Africana Studies is part of that tradition. Part of that phenomenon is eventually finding room for Black scholars outside of departments of Black studies or programs of what become Afro-American, eventually African-American studies, to be in other parts of the university structure, which is important because you don't want to have people only able to be seen as expert in one area. Just as you can certainly have white scholars, brown scholars working in Africana Studies programs and departments, Black Studies programs and departments. It's about expertise. Now, having said that, you're exactly right. There are a really impressive array of scholars working in what I will now call Afro-diasporic Blackness. So it's not just about the Black experience in the United States, but it's about diasporic experiences of people in your area, in the Caribbean, in the Afro-Caribbean world. We were both, Michelle and I are both at Yale at a moment when the notion of transatlantic history is really taking off. And so understanding the experience of Black Brits and Black Germans, and then right, I don't know if it's ironically or predictably, and now finally turning to Africa. I mean, it's really about departures from, but now it's now, okay, now let's think about the African past and its connections. So look, this is all part of an evolution, but it is an evolution about trying to be inclusive from curricular and pedagogical spaces. To me, thinking about African-American studies, Africana studies as a critical space of inquiry is, they do vital work, because here you have people who are working from many different disciplinary directions on a critical set of questions. In like my case, what I was saying, being human, being American, being civilized, but they're coming to it from all these different directions. And to me, that is a model, not just for Rutgers, but for higher education in general, for inquiry, is that you get better answers when you get people from all different kinds of disciplinary perspectives talking to one another. So I look at places like Africana Studies as important, not just in terms of what they represent for student activism, ideological activism in the 60s, not just what they represent to diversifying the academy in various ways through the 70s to the present, but what role they are playing to getting us out of our parochial spaces, thinking of geography, but also parochial spaces when it comes to how we even ask questions. And to me, that's where higher ed has been already trending for a while, I mean, the last 10 years or so, but is accelerating towards the interdisciplinary space, because that's where the best questions are going to be found, answers are going to be found. And I think Africana, African American Studies, right in the heart of it all.
Yes. It's funny what you were saying about interdisciplinarity. It makes me think of something that one of your cabinet, your recently appointed Senior Vice President of Equity, Anna Branch, has said to me when I was thinking about the development of the Institute, about how, a group of people who are trained in a similar way can often move very fast, but the solutions that they may come up with or the explorations that they may engage in will be more limited. A more diverse group of people trained in a more diverse set of methods and forms of inquiry may move a bit slower, because it may take some time to think about the different contributions and what they mean, but the solutions or the answers or the explorations they'll come up with, the modes of inquiry will take us further, will be more comprehensively effective. And I thought of that as you were talking about Africana Studies as a field, as Afro-diasporic studies and how it's constituted. So staying in this realm, I wanted to bring in a couple of questions about language that I think actually pertain to what you were talking about. I'm going to combine two questions. One comes from Linda Rivers, who is a 1981 graduate from Douglas College, and the second comes from Thomas Pyle, who is a 2013 graduate from the School of Health Professions. I'm going to link them. Linda asks, why do you believe there is a pushback to saying the phrase Black Lives Matters, Black Lives Matter? And then Thomas asks, what is the difference in today's parlance between racial equality and racial equity? So if you could talk a little bit about language there in terms of those phrases.
Thank you. Thanks to you both for the question, and for Michelle for working them together. Language matters. Word choice matters. And they really, not to be dramatic, they can become life and death. I think people push back against Black Lives Matter for a number of reasons. One, a naive, I don't know if that's really the right word, a commitment to not being, these get words matter, as I said, a commitment. There's a commitment to not knowing. There is a resistance born out of anxiety about what is not known. There is, think of all the cultural forces that have combined to tell us that Black excellence can be found in certain spaces, entertainment, athletics. But if it's found in other spaces, in admissions for a college, that's taking something from somebody. In fact, college admissions is a perfect place to think about it. That there is clearly a notion that there are people who deserve to be admitted to college, and that when you take something like affirmative action, which has benefited white women more than any other demographic population, but is coded as Black and brown folks, if people are getting in who are Black and brown, the presumption in too many instances is that they are only getting in because of affirmative action, which does violence to history, to facts, what affirmative action is, et cetera. But this is sort of the ideology. And it suggests that people don't deserve something. And so when people hear Black Lives Matter, so often people say, well, all lives matter. Of course, all lives matter. Black Lives Matter is not saying the opposite. It's not saying that all lives matter. It's saying, yeah, all lives matter. Please let's include Black lives in that, can we?
Mm-hmm.
And so there was a way in which there was this notion of what it means to be all really hasn't been about all. It's been about those people who presume they're the ones who deserve access to a university. They're the ones who deserve access to the job. They're the ones who deserve access to a resource. So for me, the strong reaction to Black Lives Matter is a commitment to not want to share, a commitment to not want to know. Some of it's naive because people just don't know, because think of the quality nature of the education that they're getting in elementary school and secondary school, where a lot of Black history still isn't taught. It's better than it was, but it still isn't taught in so many places. And so there's a naive element to it. So it's not everybody who disagrees with Black Lives Matter is a monster. They just maybe don't know. Mm-hmm. But there's absolutely a part of that population that has a very aggressive and negative read of what Black Lives Matter, because they're presuming it means my life now doesn't matter. And there's a threat there. I think that's a wild misinterpretation of Black Lives Matter, but that's where we are. And I think you can say this, much of the same thing with equality and equity, that there are equality is about, to me, a set of, I think of it more as a set of laws and processes that are designed to protect the rights of people who are frankly the most exposed, to make sure that there's equality for them. It's about opportunity. It's about, you know, the promise of a return on investment of hard work. You'll have the access to the voting booth. You'll have access to a resource. Equity is doing something quite different. I think, to me, equity is about recognizing one another's humanity, and that there's a commitment to say that people matter, that people have worth, and that they are determined to find the best in everybody, because we'll be better for it. So that, now, people can take great issue with that sort of very limited notion of equality and equity, but I think that's one way to start thinking about it. But when it comes down to it, there's a lot of anxiety, there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of naivete, and some true viciousness about people not wanting to share.
I actually cannot believe that the time is flying, although I partly can, because it's always fascinating to talk with you, Jonathan. It does move quickly whenever we're speaking, but we actually are moving along quite quickly. And so I want to make sure that I get in at least one question about kind of, we have been talking in relationship to Rutgers, but at least when there's people raise so many different things they wanted to hear you speak on, about matriculation and students, which you've mentioned a little bit about diversifying the faculty. I think the one I'm going to ask is a little bit broader, just to allow you to talk about a few different things. So both Matrice Harris from the Graduate School of Applied and Professional Psychology and Natasha Coleman, a 1998 graduate from Rutgers College, are concerned about how we work towards substantive institutional change and avoid the pitfalls of lip service. So can I ask you to speak a little bit about what steps the university can commit to taking to become an anti-racist institution under your watch, and when we might see movement from statements to action steps?
Yeah, well, thanks for the questions, plural. There's no doubt that in higher ed as a field, we are rhetorically committed to talking about diversity. Every president, every admissions officer, every deans, we all say this. I want to believe that we all mean it too, but I know that's an unequal investment. I mean, that the investments are not going to be the same. Certainly, when we look at what are view books for admission, come to our school and we're going to advertise how great we are. Those are always incredibly diverse spaces, that's a whole other kind of conversation to have. Now, so there is the rhetorical part of it. Now, the rhetorical part is critical because if it's done properly, I think it sets an agenda. That is not just a phrase that is trotted out every once in a while or only in front of certain people, but that it is important as an organizing idea for the university. This is one of the things that drew me to Rutgers, because I saw the potential to be a president where I could use diversity as a strategy for the university, as a priority, as an organizing principle, that because it's not lip service to me. So, on my first day, when I was introduced, I spoke about this as a value principle. On my first day in the office, I spoke about it again. In my first address to the University Senate, I spoke about it again. And the reason I mention that is not to toot my own horn, but to talk about consistency. And that one of my my value propositions for the university, 3 of them being academic excellence, simplifying Rutgers, because we all know it's too complicated, and that complication gets in the way of our excellence. And the third value proposition that I put, stake in the ground is equity for the institution, recognizing humanity and doing concrete things about trying to make a difference. One of my very first actions in this regard as president was creating the senior vice president for equity position, which hadn't existed before, in my cabinet. And one of the very first things I did actually I did it before that position was filled. I charged Anna Branch, who was then, I might get the title slightly wrong, but Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in New Brunswick. I asked her to do an equity audit of the central administration, which hadn't been done before. And I had her do that because I recognize, as one of the questions I guess you brought to my attention, Michelle, is saying, is like, how do we go from thought to action? And for me, I said, if we can't, we need to know how we are doing in central administration in Winans in New Brunswick. That's the building where my central administration is. We need to know how we're doing, and we need to make it public. And if we're not doing really well, we need to name it and start making changes to address it. And then that starts to model the fact that we are not just talking about diversity from the standpoint of brochure, but from actually doing something. And this is Anna Branch's charge, and that is now percolating out from my central administration, out through the chancellor-led units, and is connecting with the deans, and they're beginning to understand that I'm really quite serious about the fact that I believe excellence can be found everywhere, but you have to look for it, and you have to nurture it, you have to cultivate it. And that they can tell that resource allocations, when we get back into a place where we have resources to hand out post-COVID, are going to be aligned with this kind of commitment. So this is going to be an evolving narrative. And I invite everybody who's in on this Zoom call to pay attention, because there will be changes coming down the line in terms of how Rutgers tells it, not so much how it tells its story, because there's a lot that is great about its story, but how it embodies its story in terms, in fact, Michelle, you are the founding director of this institute. It's a huge endeavor for humanities-based. The Mellon Foundation is humanities-based. This is a massive intervention that will be having a concrete effect upon hiring practices and hiring practice for faculty, retention practices for faculty, postdoctoral opportunities. You're heading an institute that's going to ask questions at a new level at the university. And I think that is going to spill out I've already seen evidence of it spilling out into how Rutgers tells its story and how it lives its story.
I agree. Okay, we are literally minutes away from the ending. So I want to do one lighter last question, and then I know I'm going to leave it to you to close us out. But this comes from, Alexis Fisher, who is a 2020 graduate from the Camden College of Arts and Sciences. And she asks very spontaneously, what is the best advice that you have ever received?
That is not a simple question. That's a huge, geez, I can. Several things came to mind right away. They are. So my mother passed away, but was a primary school teacher, kindergarten and first grade. And Michelle, you may remember there's this book that came out. Gosh, I don't know how many years ago. 30 years ago, maybe. Robert Fulham, The Things I Learned in Kindergarten, or something like that. Check out that book. It's a very nice, some might say it's kind of saccharine, but by God, Be kind, be decent, be respectful. I mean, these are things that you'll find in that book. These are the things that I grew up under my parents' roof, that if you are kind to people, you'll be recognizing their humanity.
Mm.
If you're decent, you'll be recognizing their possibility, I think. And if you're fair, if you're, it's just, look, folks, we are all in this thing together. It rarely feels like it. We are trained to think of it in other ways. But when it comes down to it, if we will take care of one another in respectful and mindful ways, we could do so much better. Now, I want to be clear. This is not to say that we must agree with one another. No, disagreement is a perfectly healthy part of a well-functioning family, society, and series of relationships. But if we can be kind and decent and respectful in our disagreements, think about how much further we can go when we agree on things. I mean, there's no limit, basically. Now, I can add in all kinds of things about, don't waste your money, or, all kinds of stuff like, work hard, and I believe in working hard. But at the end of the day, at the beginning of the day, be kind, be nice, be decent. It'll make the world a better place.
That's great. Thank you, Alexis, for your question. I think you handled that very large question very well, Jonathan. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm going to make you have the last word. So I'm just going to take a minute to thank everyone, myself, for joining us. I know that we had over 800 people register. I'm sure we didn't have necessarily all of that out there, but we know that you are there. We thank you for being here with us, but also I want to thank you for your support and your continued engagement with the project of making Rutgers the best institution it can be in terms of academic excellence, community engagement, public service and impact, and just general human care. So with that said, I'll turn it over to you, Jonathan, to give us the last word.
I don't know how to add on to that. That was a perfect conclusion. I mean, this is all that I want for Rutgers, is to be its best version of itself. And that it doesn't start with me. It starts with everybody who tuned in, frankly. Do the hard work of being great at what you do. Do the hard work of paying attention to what Rutgers is doing, and stay connected. We need you. We need you very much. And I hope that you'll see that we can help you as well, wherever you are on your journey. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.